Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone's got enough caffeine, and I know I certainly haven't. If you didn't know, we hackers run off of caffeine. You have to keep pumping it in, otherwise we fall asleep. So, first of all, who I am. That was a pretty good introduction and covered most of it. Yep, I'm a hacker. I'm currently the VP of Cybersecurity at Okta. I'm a security researcher, so I like looking at products, finding vulnerabilities, and what may be a surprise to some people is I actually like getting them fixed. So in the case of the Tesla hack, I was particularly proud of the fact that we were able to compromise it, but more proud of the fact that we were able to get Tesla to fix most of the issues before we disclosed it, because I believe that's the way security research should work. I design hacks for the TV show Mr. Robot, so if you've seen things like the femtocell they used to hack the FBI, I actually built that in my house, and yes, it did work. Head of security for DEF CON, which usually means I spend the summer running around with my head on fire as people try to tear down hotels. Who knew 40,000 hackers in 4 hotels is chaos? And yeah, I wear too many hats. Mostly, I just like to break stuff, and sort of montage there of some of the things I've done from Tesla, Mr. Robot, Google Glass, TouchID, and more recently, Face ID and facial recognition systems. The question that sort of led to this talk is, I wanted to kind of ask myself and the community a little bit, how did we get from Matthew Broderick cutely hacking away and war dialing government systems to this? Because that's pretty much where we are now. And it's kind of a sharp change. And so I had a kind of a dig into things and had some thoughts. It's because everything's connected. Global and social media means you can reach now unprecedented numbers of people. And maybe in some case we're too successful at finding bugs and making tools. I blame you. So the last thing is, actually, maybe we've been here all the time, and all that's changed is the volume, the variety, and the velocity. So how did hackers shape the cyber battlefield? Well, let's start off with probably the first and most prevalent case of hackers working for a nation state. The CCC, or a subgroup of the CCC known as DOB, decided to use their skills to steal information from various US facilities and supposedly from some Russian facilities as well. But the big case that everyone focused on was they were stealing data out of US universities relevant to nuclear material and nuclear research, but they got caught by a systems administrator called Clifford Stoll. And Clifford noticed some discrepancies in audit logs and started analyzing them. And in that moment, he actually created the entire discipline of cyber forensics, because he started putting together processes and scientific method for finding these things. He was able later to trace this and identify Marcus Hess from the group, who ended up being prosecuted by the FBI. Now, there's a darker side to all of this as well, and this is where the allegedly stealing from the Russians and stuff may come into it, because Karl Koch, who was the leader of the group, met a very unpleasant ending. His car was found parked some distance away from his body, which was found in a patch of waste ground with a perfect circular burn around it, and he himself was burnt to death. No container of accelerant was found, and his car was covered with dust as if it had been parked inside a garage for over a year. So the TLDR out of this is, if you play stupid games, you're going to win stupid prizes. The next is a near miss. So this particular case caused absolute panic in '98. Ehud Tenenbaum was an Israeli hacker, but he wasn't doing anything for any nation state. He was just a hacker playing around with stuff. And he had recruited 2 young Californian hackers who worked with him, and they basically just hacked things, like hackers do. And they stole information, but it was mostly play fun, joyriding. They weren't really on a mission to try and steal and sell or anything. But they happened to do it at a time when tension was increasing in the Middle East. And so the US government immediately suspected that this was a cyber attack from the Iraqis. And it took a while and a multi-agency task force to analyze this, to find out, actually, no, it wasn't a nation-state attack. It was just a bunch of teenagers, which was kind of embarrassing, but it also started the ball rolling for the analysis of these things. And it also showed people what some of the potential was. And one side benefit of this is it produced one of the best films the FBI has ever made. If you want to watch a short movie, the FBI released a film called Solar Sunrise, in which they have a bunch of well-known prosecutors and other people playing dramatic roles, reenacting this case. It's definitely must-viewing. Now, this was actually an attack, and I would say this is probably one of the first conclusively proven cyber attacks against American infrastructure. We know there were probably a few others that haven't been tracked, but this was probably the most analyzed. Moonlight Maze attacks in 1998. Long suspected to be Russia, but no attribution information was conclusively pulled together, so it's speculative at best, supported by some circumstantial evidence. The actors broke into a number of non-classified but sensitive systems associated with the Pentagon, with the Air Force, Navy, and various other systems. The harsh lesson here for the US was, just because you have a classified network and everything's the classified network, your declassified network, because of ease of use and people needing access and people erring towards not classifying things because of the rigor that classification creates, your declassified networks end up full of incredibly sensitive information. And in a lot of cases, that metadata together is as valuable as some of the classified material. And I guess this opened the door to the idea of harvesting low-hanging fruit that gives you solid metadata, which then turned into some major attacks later on. Oh, and it was also the first time that anyone declared we are under a cyber war, or as Newsweek spelled it in 1980s, we're under a cyber war. I guess editorial standards were somewhat lax in the 90s. So, cyber war is accelerating and becoming normal. You look in the press now, and when you hear about a ship going off course and crashing into another ship, or you hear about a sophisticated industrial complex being shut down, it's almost the norm to assume that maybe there's some cyber element to this. And that shows you just how successful this has been and just how far it's spreading. And there are some reasons to it, which I'll go into in a minute. But it's getting to the point where every single nation now has some degree of a cyber capability. So how has this changed the battlefield? Well, going back to how this is spreading so far, nations now have an unprecedented reach for minimal investment and risk. A tiny country can take on a giant country for just a few $1,000s, launching a small operation which only risks maybe one or two people, and probably not even directly because they can do it remotely. That's a game changer in terms of asymmetric warfare. You don't have to expose your assets. You can do it in such a disconnected way that plausible deniability is almost unbreakable. Cyber ammunition is cheap and targets are easily selected. The vast majority of extremely successful campaigns have come from targeting low-hanging fruit. You don't have to invest in O-Days. I mean, O-Days are certainly useful as a tool, but they don't need to be thrown around wildly. You can get incredible success with simple things. The vulnerabilities used in both the Solar Sunrise and Moonlight Maze attacks were well-known Solaris vulnerabilities that had been documented and patched months before the attacks took place. And that's going to be a continuing cycle because businesses still do not know how to handle vulnerabilities properly, and businesses still don't know how to patch properly. And the same goes even more for the military organizations. Data drives influence, and influence is now a weapon. We have unprecedented tools. Big data has opened the door to harvesting data like at levels never seen before. You can correlate things that we couldn't have even dreamed of. And now it's a weapon. And we've seen just how effective it is. Influence can drive wedges into fractures in social society that allow you to split up groups that may not have even been ready to fragment. And groups that were fragmenting can just be shattered into pieces. And we've seen the effect of this in terms of influence over elections, causing civil unrest. It's a whole new ballgame. Waging asymmetric war has never been easier. And the other one, which is rather than the end-to-end encryption that was pushed out post-Snowden, ending SIGINT, it's actually cracked open the Platinum Age, because forced to adapt with increasing encryption, collection systems changed and moved. And now the bulk of highly successful collection comes directly from the endpoint or directly from human assets who are encouraged to collect it by offering them fuzzy cat ears or some other silly gift. And they are more than willing to use that to harvest data for you and ship it. And as a result, this has opened up OSINT and HUMINT at mass scale. So there are now three aspects to cyber war that need to be thought about. Instead of, traditionally, if you look at the early attacks, they were all about information gathering, and they were all pure cyber. Someone broke into a system, stole some data, exfiltrated that data. Now you've got the cyber category, which we understand pretty well, because that's what we've faced for a while. We have the cyber physical, which is developing. I think we do understand it reasonably well, but it's new. If you go back 20 years, people weren't using cyber attacks to cause physical damage to systems. Now, it's a viable option in many campaigns and many cases, because people understand that there are industrial controls out there that can be exploited, that there are cyber physical interfaces that can be exploited, and it's an option. But the newest one, which is cyber cognitive or cyber information, is still very not well understood. We see campaigns where people are able to push out a single image or a single meme which self-propagates through entire social groups and can't be stopped. When governments step in and censor it, it just accelerates it. And so a big chunk of this is, how do we understand these information campaigns? How do we classify them, catalog them, and then what are the appropriate countermeasures for them? So cyber information warfare. Information has come a really long way in a very short time. Just going back and a few hundred years, and you're looking at printing presses and peer-to-peer distribution of material. Within the space of about 100 years, you've moved on to electronic information distribution, and now within the last 50 years, we've moved on to mass distribution of information directly to millions of people at once, or directly to individual people, and customized so that the messages are tailored specifically for that person automatically, without you having to do anything to learn about them. And the information assets out there to do that are increasing. Every breach adds to this. Every vulnerable, exposed network or database adds to this. The power of influence is incredible. We now live in an age where pop stars have higher influence than our world leaders. And those pop stars are in a position, real or not, to drive our people and our citizens in incredible ways. Influence is incredibly powerful. People will believe something said by an influencer, like, way more than they would from an official. The stat here is that people said they feel more excited about doing things, their friends agree with it, and 68% of them said they usually do not make major decisions without discussing it with the people they trust. That's the power of influence. So, common warfare strategies. You can set out to distort by pushing counter-information that changes the perspective and changes the understanding of the material that you want to shift. You can seek to dismiss by pushing information out in a way that people see it and see it as a counter-narrative to whatever else has been pushed. And we see this quite a lot now on Facebook and Instagram as people push out alternative facts to completely counter one position or another. You can seek to distract by overwhelming with information or placing information at a specific point in time that can then lead to catastrophic effects. You can seek to divide, which is what I mentioned before, by looking for the micro fractures you see in social groups and then targeting those fractures through prejudice, through racism, through social hatred, through all of these kind of darker aspects of our personalities. You can use those as wedges to drive these fractures open, dividing groups up and setting them against each other. And then finally, you can set out to dismay by constantly pumping information that shows people that their world is ending, or they have no chance of winning an election, or they have no chance of succeeding with their campaign. National instruments of influence. So these are the aspects within countries that can be used to drive influence or be driven. Diplomatic relationships, either real ones or fake ones. Informational systems, the military, and obviously the economy. On the business side, it's similar. We're talking about business deals, strategic partnerships, PR and advertising, mergers and acquisitions, and then research and development and capital instruments. Prejudice, misinformation, and fear can turn simple vulnerabilities into critical ones. This is an example that I did a little while ago. At the end of the day, people want to believe the worst about some of their prejudices. And so if you put a message up at a time when people are vulnerable, and in this case, the example is, imagine you're boarding an airplane, and on the screen in front of you pops up one of these three messages. Would you stay on that airplane? Well, I mean, would you try? As a pilot, if you saw this. Would you? I don't know. I'm sorry, if I looked at my seat and I saw this, and I looked across all the other seats and I saw the same things, I think I would try pretty hard.
I worry
the air marshals. Honestly, I think the air marshal might be one of the first people leaving. But as a pilot, would you fly a plane that's been compromised in this manner?
Yes, because Europe is
Yeah. Right. So this bug, which would, under conventional scoring systems, only rank a 1 on the CVSS score, can ground an entire fleet of airplanes for an entire country. That's the power of misinformation. Harvesting. So mass encryption has not killed SIGINT. Cognitive attacks, like these misinformation attacks, thrive on data. And this has driven innovation, and this has driven scale. So now, instead of people doing small-scale collection of assets and information, we're seeing apps and we're seeing tools that go out and they bring in huge amounts of data. There's a couple I'll go into in a minute, but it's all about being automated, and it's all about big data. The most effective collection now comes directly from endpoint. HUMINT and OSINT like you've never seen before. Example 1, Cambridge Analytica. You've probably all heard about it, what it did. They pushed out a questionnaire and invited people to put in some personality information. But at the same time, it had overbroad permissions that allowed it to collect profile information, metadata, etc. from the target, plus all their associated friends. The net result was, with 270,000 participants, they were able to collect solid information on targets for 70 million users. That's incredible asymmetric success. And this is just the beginning. FaceApp. So all of you may have seen it. It's the cool, cute application that you install that makes you look older or puts cat ears on your head. It was installed by 150 million users. There's some debate about exactly what data it collected. The permissions were that it could collect everything, but people who analyzed it saw only facial information and metadata going up. But even if you just consider the metadata, one of the biggest challenges with facial recognition right now is coming up with a data set that you can train your facial recognition systems in an unbiased way. Because right now, facial recognition systems in China are really good at detecting Chinese faces, but terrible at detecting Western faces. And the same goes all over the world. The best way to solve it is to create a diverse data set. Well, with this harvesting tool, they managed to create the world's biggest and most diverse facial data set. And all the other information they may have got, such as the ability to correlate relationships between people, etc., were just bonus prizes. Now, here's a really interesting one. I have no evidence this is being used to collect data, but what it does is quite amazing. Huawei P30 is Huawei's flagship phone. It has a state-of-the-art camera in it that would honestly make many of the spy cameras in the Cold War jealous. It has a optical zoom, which does 5 times, and it has an AI-enhanced digital zoom, which does 10 times. So that's a total of 50 times zoom. When you take photographs of text, it's automatically processed using the AI to OCR that text. The data then gets uploaded to Huawei servers, which is the slightly sketchy part. I did some practical tests on this to see what risk it could represent. And here's an example. So I went to the San Francisco Philharmonic and watched a concert and tested out how much I could zoom in. And you can see the progression of the zoom. The end result was, sitting about 120 to 150 feet away, I was able to zoom into the music sheets of the musicians playing in the orchestra. And as soon as I did, the privacy notice came up informing me the data had just been uploaded to China and OCR'd. That's kind of scary. That means I can read documents from 12 floors away with a camera phone. That changes the dynamics in terms of physical security quite a lot. I did another test at a facility, which I shan't mention where it was, but I went to a civilian viewing area from that facility, this is in the US, and I took photographs, and I was able to zoom with this camera in past the viewing area, so I was in the approved area, into the actual systems and into the control room, and take a photograph of the no pictures sign inside their control room. That's scarily powerful, and it means we have to rethink some of the lessons that we've had about how far away. Huh? No. No. Yeah, but I'm not showing it. I don't want to really set out to embarrass anyone, because the problem isn't what they've done. The problem is the world is moving on. The technology has emerged that some of these static rules we have of you must have this much distance between civilians and the perimeter might not be right anymore. And we have to start thinking about these new tools and techniques and how they change our world. So, what does this all mean? And to the point just there, we need to rethink our understanding of impact. So instead of just looking at vulnerabilities and saying, does this give me control of something? Can I slap a CVS score on it? And if it gets a score above 5 or 6, then we're going to patch it in a hurry. If it gets a score below 5 or 6, it will probably sit around for a week or more. And if it gets a score of 1, who cares? We now need to think about these things in much more detail and use intelligence when we do it. So we need to think about it from a cyber perspective, what the impacts are. We need to think about it from a physical perspective, whether there are direct or indirect impacts that can be gained from it. And we need to think about it from a cognitive impact. Can I push information to an unsuspecting user while they're in a vulnerable state, like trapped in an airplane, that will then cause dismay or which will cause them to panic? So we need to rethink the classification of vulnerabilities. Scoring methods to classify vulnerabilities are inadequate at the moment. We need to allocate resource and priority based on we allocate resource and priority based on an incomplete picture. However, the last 10 years, the game's changed. Much of our impact assessment comes from the control of the system. However, as we said, the picture is much bigger. Low bugs can no longer be assumed to be low. Informal bugs may actually be high. Displaying the wrong message could be critical. We really need to add context intelligence to accurately classify bugs. Also, hackers are now targets. As far as the rules of war, we are enemy combatants. And so, if you're playing around with systems, you need to understand the risk of what you're doing. If you're sitting in a sensitive country and you're playing around, scanning or probing their systems, there is a very high chance you could be seen as an enemy combatant. And even worse, if you happen to do that in a war zone, there's a very high chance you're going to get a special present from the sky. And this is something that we as hackers need to learn and be very careful about. And we as information security professionals need to recognize that young hackers growing up need to be protected from this. We need to teach them the path to righteousness. We need to show them how they can exercise their skills without exposing themselves to risk. Because at the end of the day, we need them. Those are the future. So, we need to educate. One of the best defenses against all these kinds of cyber threats is an educated population. We need to teach the civilian population to be intelligently paranoid. We need to identify and fast-track talented youth, preferably before they cross lines. We need to make sure nobody gets left behind if you want a truly secure digital workplace, because the one person who hasn't been taught becomes the weak link in the chain that gets exploited. And I have to say, from being here, I have to give props out to the UAE. What I saw of the UAE Cyber Academy here is excellent. This is a really good start and a really good direction to do this. Engage the kids young with the kind of systems that they can relate to and that they enjoy playing with, and teach them. Lastly, I'm going to spotlight two hackers who are working to change the landscape. First, my good friend Katie Missouri, or Missouri Rex, Missourius Rex, as she likes to be called. Katie set out to renegotiate the Wassenaar agreement. In 2013, 41 countries revised the Wassenaar agreement to regulate the export of intrusion software and intrusion software technology. Katie and Ian Mulholland, representing the State Department, worked to renegotiate the scope. It's thanks to their work that we don't have to fill out export license applications for vulnerability disclosure or incident response. It's this kind of work that keeps the research that we are doing flowing. And we have to keep an eye on this, and we have to support Katie and all of these missions, because if we don't, we're going to be stifled. Because the harsh reality is, while these controls are good and necessary, we need to remember the bad guys don't follow them. And so we don't want to hamstring ourselves while at the same time liberate our opposition. Sarah Jane Turp is ex-UK, working in the US to counter misinformation campaigns. One of her primary goals is to come up with a taxonomy and system to classify misinformation attacks and to understand the life cycle of those attacks. She coined the term misinfosec to enable mapping of security principles, and she created the Credibility Coalition's Misinfosec Working Group to develop ARMIT, tactics and techniques and procedures-based frameworks, and STX extensions to give misinformation researchers and responders a common language to discuss and disrupt misinformation incidents. And it wouldn't be fair not to give a shout out to Pablo Brewer from US SOCOM and the Donovan Group, who has put almost as much into developing this stuff and supported Sarah's work in an incredible way. And this is one of the products they've come out with. It's a little small to read, but yeah, feel free to take a picture, or you'll be able to download the slides later. The idea is all misinformation campaigns have artifacts. And if we can understand those artifacts, and the framework, by the way, is based on the attack framework published by MITRE, so it should correlate with the framework. You can use these artifacts and use them to understand the stage that misinformation campaigns are in, And ultimately, that should give us the tools to counter these campaigns and to learn how to counter them appropriately rather than potentially accelerating them by doing the wrong thing. So, conclusion. Hacking has actually always been a part of warfare. It's just had different names at different periods of time, and the frequency has changed, the volume, the variety has all changed. But it's really been there for a while. Hackers will always be the best equipped at offense and defense because it's part of who we are. You can train someone to be really good at cybersecurity, and that is a good thing. But they will never really compete with true hackers because of the passion in what we do and the drive behind what we do. And so we need to find more hackers and increase engagement between hackers and these systems. Hackers have to help the landscape themselves to change in responsible and less risky ways. And that means building trust across groups. That means trusting our governments, and it means trusting our law enforcement, and it means working in a less opaque way, in a more transparent way. And then finally, hackers need to recognize that their actions have greater impact than ever before. You can literally get killed now for making the wrong decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc Rogers. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hey, Jimmy. Sorry. So you said like a lot of the techniques we're talking about here, the psychological manipulation, the disinformation. Could you say some of that we already have an existing body of knowledge in marketing and promotion and things like this?
Yeah, and a lot of this, the skills behind this aren't new.
Right.
If you look at some of the old propaganda campaigns run by the military, this has been going on for a long time. We've always tried to leverage relationships between different societal groups to try and change things. The reality is, historically, we've always been really bad at doing it. You know, we make assumptions based on racial prejudice or based on ignorance, and then we turn that into a propaganda campaign and push it out. And largely, they've been meh in terms of success. But what's happened now is by harvesting data, we can actually do the same kind of analysis that advanced marketing people do to understand the behaviors of the targets they're going after, and then essentially segment our attacks so they're going to be more believable and have more impact with the groups that we reach out to.
More targeted groups, so like a focus group for good, convince or engage with or whatnot, perhaps.
Yeah. And there's indication that in some cases they do trial runs of these campaigns to see the effect on small groups. They'll generate a self-propagating meme and distribute it in a social channel to see how far it goes, and then tweak it as necessary.
Mm-hmm. Fun time. Oh, quick question. You brought up about the finding new talent and finding young hackers, convincing them to that thing. What was it? The Hacker Manifesto, right? What was the concept? Like, it resonated because for a lot of us, that was us. It was we skew towards that being slightly more advanced than maybe the rest of the class.
Yep.
Right? So there were, like in the US, we had programs like gifted and talented programs that would take you out of the major group and put you in like a smaller class, getting more targeted information or targeted training or targeted courses,
Yep.
But funding to that's been cut. And if you're trying to fund and bring, new talent to even government or military or whatever, you need to do like you're doing here in the UAE, start training young, get them early.
Yep, exactly.
Get their loyalty first. Get their. That's another nice thing. The loyalty and the patriotism is useful for training for things like that.
Yep.
But we tend to go the exact opposite way, where we punish us hackers for hacking.
Yeah, no, totally.
And not training each other,
I was shocked when I moved to America and moved to Silicon Valley, and my children couldn't get computing classes in Silicon Valley.
Wow.
And I'm like, how are we preparing for a digital workplace if our kids aren't even being trained, let alone cybersecurity training? And so this kind of inspired me to start doing this and building some programs. But you're right. Schools will not solve the problem because they don't have the resources. So it's up to us to work to create parallel tracks. Now, one of the most successful ways, clearly, is getting the government's buy-in and helping them set up things like these cyber academies. This is great. I'm not sure how well it would work in a country as big as America, but I think it's a phenomenal example of what can be done right. And we may have to start small by looking at online or offline training and come up with an interface into the school to identify these kids and plug them into it. But we are the right audience to solve this because the teachers aren't going to solve it, and I don't think the policymakers are going to solve it.
Thanks. And another question here.
Hi, Mark. So if you look into the last several decades, we can see increased volume of the information which people should process. And we have a situation of phenomena called fragmentary thinking. So when people are doing their decision on the short phrases like on this screen. So we read news captions. News captions are catchy, and we don't read the content of the articles and still coming to conclusions. So do you have any ideas except very critical thinking and confirmation from several sources before make decision? Any suggestions to people how to approach this problem with huge volume of information to make decision?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, I would say the first thing is to aware that you may be subject to cognitive bias, and that people are looking to see they're looking to get the answers that they believe are out there, and they will often only continue down a path if it's fulfilling their confirmation bias. So you have to start out with healthy skepticism, and that's what I mentioned before. Be paranoid and skeptical. Don't trust anything you read first. Maybe give some more credibility to primary news sources, but look at multiple different sources and look at the dissonance between the different ones. But it is hard. And that's one of the reasons why I think the solution to a lot of this is education. Because many of the people who are being targeted in this are getting their information not even from the news, they're getting it from their friends. They're seeing posts on Facebook, and because it came from their friend, they trust it. And so now we have two problems. One, we have to train the people who are posting these things to only post from trustworthy sources. So teach them how to do that and recognize that. But two, we need to teach people not to immediately take something that a friend posts as gospel and actually look into it and challenge it. And that's a hard journey. It's something we're looking at as part of this working group, but yeah, it's going to take some time.
Hi, Mark. I want to ask the question on the screen. I think the first top one. What message should we give security and users to enable them to prolong their privacy? Yeah, it's the first question. Thank you. On the screen, yeah.
The biggest challenge here is that people don't understand the value of their private data. So the fact that people are willing to download an app that gives them fuzzy ears and surrender their personal information without considering the consequences is a huge problem. The fact that they are able to surrender the information of the people they're associated with is an even bigger problem. If you have a friend who works in a secure job, doing work for the government or law enforcement, and you then download an app that dumps your social circle and the relationships, you have done damage, not just to yourself, but to your friend and their relationships. And somehow we need to get people to understand the consequences of these things and realize that actually, you know what? This isn't just throwaway data. This isn't just a little bit of information. Oh, it's just my name and my face and my friends. That's actually incredibly dangerous information from an intelligence perspective if it's uncontrolled. And we have to get people to look at it that way. And how we get them to understand that is hard. Right? We have to teach them that there are real consequences for surrendering that data. But I fear many of them won't be convinced until something hurts them. The other thing we have to do is we need to crack down on some of these platforms to say, well, okay, if someone wants to surrender their data, maybe we just have to let them, but they should not be able to surrender somebody else's data and then compromise an entire network.
Another one here, Mark?
Well, you kind of answered my question towards the very end. I was actually going to flip it around and say, would the makers of the platforms, especially the mobile platforms, can they be convinced through pressure, through social pressure, to implement something like Halvar Flake's bank statement for applications? Because if you make the exit of privacy visible, people start taking notice. People don't see private data flowing out through the waves and being sucked up at massive amounts. But if it were to be made visible, then there's too much data leaving.
Yep.
You start taking notice of it.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think one of the challenges with it is we know people are suffering from security fatigue.
Yes.
Constantly bombarded with breach notices, constantly told about applications, vulnerabilities, and phone vulnerabilities. We have to come up with a way to control what messages people get.
Yeah, this is for the common public who's probably just, buys a phone from the store, signs up for everything, and then goes about their daily life with data being stolen every second from them.
Yeah.
And once it's visible, they'll start thinking, and then you take the horse to the water and see what they do.
Yep. And one of the thoughts I've had is that marketing had a very similar problem years ago when they realized that people were getting fatigue from marketing messages.
Yes.
Being spammed with people trying to sell you stuff actually makes all of the product sales go down. And so what they did was they started correlating and combining different messages so they were more strategic about the information they gave so that people weren't fatigued. I think we need to do that in the security industry. We need to turn off the fire hose and make sure people are receiving specific and relevant information so that they feel it's information they need to act on rather than stuff they need to tune out.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Any other questions from the floor? Maybe then we'll move on to some of the questions that are on the app. I think the next one is, which nations do you foresee actually initiating an actual cyber war publicly?
All of them, and half of them are doing it already. I mean, it's a cheap way for a country to gain a strategic advantage. I would say any country that's not taking some kind of strategic advantage or that's not investing in cyber to defend its shores is probably falling far behind the others.
All right, and the next one, Pixar, it didn't happen.
You can't be just saying that.
But
Pixar, it didn't happen.
were those pics in there? What pics do you want to see?
The power of the Zoom. Anyway.
Well, I showed you the safe one.
And then the next one, why do you think that in schools, yes, curricular hacking doesn't get taught? I think you covered a little bit of it, but because...
Sorry, why do I... Can you read the question again? I can't quite see.
Why do you think that in schools, cybersecurity curriculum hacking doesn't get taught? Because if the general negative stigma surrounding hacking doesn't change, how far can we advance our knowledge of it?
I think there's an earlier question. Why doesn't cyber and often IT get taught in schools? And the answer is they don't have the teachers with the knowledge to teach it, and they don't have the budget for the equipment, and so it doesn't happen, especially in poorer schools.
Right.
And so if you're not going to teach IT and technology, you're not going to teach about hackers. Maybe there's an argument to have some kind of history section talking about some of this stuff, but then I can see the perspective that might be dangerous unless you come up with a way then to harness the questions that are going to come out. Personally, I think we should. I think every school should teach kids about cyber as a minimum. How do you stay safe online? How do you recognize bullying? How do you recognize catfishing? What do you do when you are being bullied? If someone tries to radicalize you, how do you respond to that? What does it look like? All of these questions. If we educate our kids, we make them safer.
Thanks for that. And I think it's also a sentiment that's really well communicated here in the UAE. We find that for Abu Dhabi this year, we did a youth hub section, and we could feel that the younger generation is really hungry for it. So it's definitely a receptive audience, and it'd be really great that that's deployed in all countries around the world in the curriculum. Sorry to add to that.
Yep.
Moving on, next to you, Benjamin.
How do you believe in that a coexistence between the government and authority military sector is possible between the, say, independent hackers that are out there and still be maybe a threat for them? Because I believe in if these people are exchanging their information about the vulnerability, these people will as well use the vulnerability to attack the next party. And that's speeding up the wheel each time. So I ask myself on how you see that in this from this perspective.
I don't disagree. I think we're in dangerous times because a lot of the tools that we develop and a lot of the assets we build have multi-uses, and some of those uses are very dangerous, and there are people who will do anything to get hold of them and use them unethically. one of the best things we can do is to behave the way you've been behaving, which is to build ethical processes and resilience around yourself. Build things like disclosure platforms, or like the way Katie does, build processes that ensures good hygiene with handling of bugs and that stuff. If we build the right rules around us and get endorsement from governments and other people, we can at least cocoon ourselves with some shelter that prevents even some governments from abusing that. But you'll never completely rule it out because, it's when a bug is worth a couple of $1 million, there is a lot of things that people will do to get hold of it.
So we've got 3 more questions. We do have time.
Okay.
So I'd like to cover the next one, which is shadow brokers leaked tools like Eternal Blue, giving all threat actors access to advanced cyber weapons. To your knowledge, has there been any leaks or insights on advanced cyber defense strategies?
From my perspective, the biggest insight is actually none of these leaked cyber weapons are actually that special. What most nation states call an advanced persistent threat, I call Benjamin. It's what we call hackers in the 90s, We would break into systems and we would do everything we could to remain inside that system. And we would develop our own tools. Those tools resemble things like Eternal Blue.
Right.
I built multi-chain exploits so that I could do things back in the 90s that are way more sophisticated than anything the government's leaked so far. So part of me hopes they've got some better stuff, and part of me is kind of glad that none of it's leaked yet.
Okay. All right, so we'll take the last question first, which is, since these cyber cognitive agents are partly implemented from seemingly scientific sources, how would the general public protect themselves or become immune to these attacks?
So these tools are actually designed for us, for researchers and for hackers, so we can understand it. There is another exercise that we need to build the tools for people. And we need to look into how we have to educate and how we have to communicate. Because you're right, you can't just put a framework like that in front of an ordinary person and go, here, Gran, read that and you'll be safe. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
We all, if we want to counter information warfare and we want to stop foreign nations from interfering in our political processes or disrupting our civilization and our democracies, then we need to take action to arm ourselves against it. And that means education and it means preparing stuff.
Right.
So the last one, who's my favorite hacker hero? I have so many. One of the things they say, don't meet your heroes because they're disappointing. There's a couple that I have met who aren't. And so I'm going to say Donald Knuth is one of them. Donald Knuth wrote the book on computer science and programming. He also largely invented the discipline of computer security. And he's an amazing guy. I'm privileged to hang out with him at an event every November. And every year he has new and interesting questions. Last year he caught me in a corner and was like, I've been hearing you talk about reverse engineering. I want you to tell me, how do you think we can reverse engineer code that's been written by an AI? So at first you think, wait a minute. AIs don't write code like humans. They don't need it to be legible, or they don't need to follow the same constraints. So how do you audit that code? And so that's an interesting mind bender. That's the other stuff that he does. And the other is probably Steve Wozniak. Again, a really human person. He's done so well, but yet he'll still travel to cities and take Apple geniuses out to dinner. He's not part of Apple anymore, but he just feels the need to pay back and be human. And I love that, especially in someone as successful as him.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marc Rogers, the true Mr. Robot. Thank you very much.